welcome everyone to a special edition podcast here at The American Mind. I'm Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review books and The American Mind. Many of you know our regular weekly podcast, The Roundtable, where we cover the news with my colleagues at The American Mind. And then it's been a while, but occasionally I'll do special interviews with scholars in the Claremont orbit on their books or latest work, or sometimes some political things. So this special episode is Michael Anton, senior fellow at the Claremont Institute and research fellow at Hillsdale College's Washington, D.C. Center. Mike also teaches at their D.C. Center there. Mike's a longtime friend of Claremont. Many of you know him from his Flight 93 election essay, infamous from September of 2016. He's a frequent essayist at the Claremont Review books, former Trump administration official. Mike's a great guy and a good friend. Mike is interviewing Charles Haywood, who's also not quite as a longtime friend of the Claremont Institute, but a friend of recent years. As Mike will mention in his introduction of Charles in the upcoming part of the episode, Charles runs an interesting book review blog called The Worthy House. Charles is a now retired industrialist from the Midwest, has thought a lot about politics, about policy, about our current position right now. He reviewed, among other things, Mike Anton's book, The Stakes. They've become fast friends. So they wanted to just take this opportunity to talk about our current state of American politics. They cover the waterfront. They talk about regime decay in America. They talk about Straussianism, West Coast and East Coast. They talk about one of the topics of Mike's book, which is Caesarism in America, where it might go. I'll let them explain the interesting history of that term in political philosophy and political history. They talk about, interesting thinkers on the right, what we ought to do in our current situation, reasons for hope, reasons for skepticism that this current regime that we're in is going to last all that much longer. I will say these are all interesting topics. I let them go pretty much uncensored, unedited. I don't take personal responsibility for everything said in this podcast, but I think it's in the best spirit of good conversations. It's free-ranging. It's two intelligent men talking about the state of affairs in America. We are all at least agreed with Mike and Charles, and the larger Claremont community is in agreement, and I certainly am, that we're in, if not quite the acute crisis in America, we're in a kind of rolling constitutional crisis. My colleague Angelo Codevilla has called it a cold civil war, where we have deep divisions over principle. We have a decayed republic that is small r republic. And I think all good citizens, all thoughtful citizens, certainly all friends of the Claremont Institute are trying to think through what to do about it. And that's the spirit in which you should take this podcast. And thank you for listening. With that, I will turn things over to Mike.
So I'll start by saying thank you, Ryan, for that. And thank you for allowing us this opportunity. This is a somewhat, I know, unusual episode of the Claremont Institute podcast. Even though I have been a guest on before, I've never hosted. And then, of course, we also have a very special guest who I want to introduce. His name is Charles Haywood. Now, I first came across Charles. He did then and still writes a blog called The Worthy House, it's a blog, but it's a book review. It's a serious book review. And unlike a lot of book reviews that actually don't talk about the books that they review, this one does. It's clear the author of the reviews has read the books and has thought about them, and came across this before his name was on it. It was just this person named Charles, was all the posts were signed. I didn't know who it was, but it was thoughtful and serious. And he reviewed some of my books, and I was impressed by the attention and level of detail that went into it. And it turns out that we knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody. I don't remember all the details, but there was a Claremont connection between us and Charles somehow. And we were all formally introduced about a year ago, maybe a little bit more than a year ago. And we were pleased to meet him. And since then, Charles he can maybe explain this however much detail he wants, and I won't say much, but has had a career change, which has enabled him to put his name on the blog. All the content is still there, but instead of the post saying posted by Charles, it now says by Charles Haywood. So now everyone knows who he is. So I would commend people to that website, theworthyhouse.com, and read those reviews. Again, serious reviews of serious books. Although he does review unserious books, as all book reviewers have to do from time to time. in order to tell you like why this thing is somehow important and yet stupid, but you need to understand the stupidity. I had some things that I wanted to say, but about his review of my most recent book. But before I do that, I want to stop and let Charles say whatever he wants to say first.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'll try not to be long-winded. People sometimes ask me why I started writing book reviews, which I started doing 2016 or so, initially just on Amazon, though eventually Amazon deplatformed me from the reviews. I was up to, I think, number 31 out of all of their 100 million or so reviewers, but they were a little bit too right-wing for Amazon, so off they went. So I've only had the website for 3 or 4 years, and as you say, I recently put my last name on it as well because I had a career change, which perhaps I'll touch on later, but which makes me more or less uncancelable, which is nice. But people sometimes ask me why I started writing book reviews, and it's not because necessarily that I think people were all dying to hear what I wanted to say, though frankly it has had surprising popularity, or at least surprising to me. It's mostly because I have a terrible memory. And so my father was a Russian history professor, and he had a great memory, but I did not inherit this memory. So I started writing book reviews initially just for myself, because that was a way of fixing in my own mind what was in the books I had just read, because otherwise a week later I'd be like, what was that about? So, and over time I've used it to develop into kind of a coherent set of thoughts, political philosophy, for lack of a better term, without overrating it, with the idea being that together all the reviews, of which there's 500 or so now, a couple of million words, form a at least semi-coherent whole. So hopefully people, if they go there, will enjoy reading their reviews. It's categorized. There's no money. There's no way to give me money. I don't want your money. This is purely a public service and a way for me to aggrandize myself. So I enjoy it. I hope other people enjoy it.
I would note too, which you didn't mention, and you can correct me if I have this wrong, that the title of the blog, The Worthy House, comes from T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom.
It does, but he stole it from Proverbs.
But
it does come from the epigraph for his 7 Pillars of Wisdom. It has a poem at the beginning, which refers to the 7-pillared worthy house, which is a phrase from Proverbs.
It's a book that I have read a number of times, although it's been quite a while. And, I use not that book, but I do in more than one of my classes. If readers or Charles, you haven't seen it, it's easy to get. T.E. Lawrence was asked in the 1920s to write the Encyclopedia Britannica article on irregular or insurgency warfare. And he turned in a fairly short 10 or 12 page treatise on the subject based on his actual experiences in the Arab Revolt and, in the Turkish theater, the Middle Eastern theater of World War I. And it's a mix of theory and practice and practical sort of reflections, beautifully written and done. And also, I think, highly relevant to this day. That is to say, in another book that I like to use in teaching, a book that is or used to be famous that I don't think is much read anymore, but used to be very, very famous, called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by Alfred Thayer Mahan. In the introduction, he says, why are we going back and studying all of these ancient and, medieval and early modern battles when technology has changed? And he says, because there are ways in which technology changes strategy, and then there are strategic concepts that absolutely transcend any kind of technological change. And you need to know both, and you need to know the difference. And this book is going to help you do that. I think Lawrence's essay on insurgency or irregular warfare is one such thing. It's the kind of thing where you say, well, they're on horses and they just have, bolt action rifles. So what relevance does that have in the days of body cams and JDAMs and stuff like that? Well, it has a lot of relevance, and you can read the piece and figure out why. In fact, if the U.S. military had a better understanding of that, I think before the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, they might have had, I don't know, different outcomes, but they might have had some more success with different tactics than what they did.
I'll look it up, and that actually sounds very interesting. And I've not read Mahan's book, though I've heard of it repeatedly. It's referred to, but I think the kind of unspoken thing here is that there's a lot of people who are concerned that the irregular warfare is something that is in our own future. So hopefully that's not the case, but certainly that's something that is worth learning about.
Well, yes, I leave it to you to tease out that implication. But it may be, or it may not be. The one thing I do know is that I don't think the practice of it will ever go away. That is to say, it may be dormant for a while. But what Lawrence makes clear is if you are a people, a population invaded by a hostile power, but they're on essentially your land and you have the connection to the local population and knowledge of the geography and a greater ability to resupply and live off the land and hide and things like that. Yes, it is impossible to inflict battle defeats on a well-equipped regular army, so you should avoid that at all costs. But it is quite possible to wear down a regular army to the point where either it or its political leadership just says, I can't achieve the goal that I want to achieve here, and so I'm going to leave. And I don't know, that sounds somewhat relevant to our time. Isn't that kind of what the U.S. military is doing in Afghanistan right now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Going home.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but you touch on some of that stuff in the States. Without predicting specifically what the future would hold. But to the extent America is divided philosophically and that those divisions are represented to some extent geographically, that kind of possibility, you have to be kind of a Pollyanna to not see that as a potential for the United States or some subset of the United States. I mean, you don't have to go all crazy about it to see that these things have relevance even to our world.
We could get into this a bit, and I hope we do. There are quite a lot of, I think, Pollyanna-ish conservatives or, quote unquote conservatives on the right who just, to be unfair, but maybe not inaccurate to their spirit, they say, well, Reagan was optimistic, therefore we should be optimistic. Like, that's fast. In fact, I don't read the New York Times and I don't read David Brooks, but I do have a lot of friends who text me things. And so all kinds of things cross my nose that I maybe otherwise would wish that I hadn't seen. And just this morning, I was sent in blocks of text, some paragraphs, some really exceptionally stupid paragraphs from David Brooks, basically making this point, there's conservatism is at a crossroads again. Are we going with the optimists or the pessimists? And he just says, I'm choose optimism. We should all choose optimism because it's optimistic. It's like, are you optimistic on the North Atlantic, April, I forgot the date, 14th, 1912 at midnight? Okay, well, the ship is going to sink. You can be optimistic, right? But at that point, as the movie, which is otherwise somewhat untrue to history, but somewhat true, as once they show the builder, Thomas Andrews, the diagram, and say, these compartments are open, he knows instantly, oh yeah, going down, right? So optimism depends on a circumstance. It is reasonable to be optimistic in a period of rising times. Or, if I may, I just had occasion to use this the other day. The preface to book 2 of Machiavelli's Discourses. So the preface to book 1, Machiavelli says, it's all about praise of the past, right? Why is it that we don't look to the past anymore? He's writing in the early 16th century when he says people, they collect ancient statues, they read ancient law books, they study ancient anatomy or medical texts, but nobody studies ancient politics. We think that we have nothing to learn from the ancients, whereas we really need to go back. And then he switches the argument up in the preface to book 2, and he begins by saying, people often praise the past and blame the present, but not always reasonably. And then he makes the eminently reasonable point that your praise of the past and blame of the present, or vice versa, absolutely depends on when and where you live. So if you are someone alive in rising times, in a proud and confident society that is on its way up, and you blame the present and praise the past, you're mistaken. If, on the other hand, you are alive in Rome in 350 AD and you blame the present and praise the past, you are correct, right? So this whole question of optimism versus pessimism as fundamental categories of mind that somehow determine anything is ridiculous. It's just a question of what's going on in the moment, right? If I carry like right now, I'm sitting here in Northern Virginia. There are no clouds in the sky. If I were to walk outside with an umbrella, that would be idiotic. Now, that would be undue pessimism, I would say. But if, like David Brooks, a giant storm were passing through with high winds and torrential rains, and I walked outside in a t-shirt and shorts with no umbrella, because I am optimistic, that would be idiotic. That's what conservatism has become. It's that level of idiocy in so many ways.
Well, the prudence is required, and I'm very optimistic, and I'll come back to that. On David Brooks, though,
right.
I'm kind of notorious in my blog for being mean to people like Brooks or Jonah Goldberg. And I wrote a piece on Brooks. Sometimes I do not just book reviews, but I write pieces that I call analysis, which are like on something. So I wrote on communitarianism, which basically was an attack on David Brooks. and his, bogus communitarianism. And I called him like the gimp of the left and all these kind of, as in bring out the gimp, and it was kind of mean. But my point is that he's optimistic because he's basically a man of the left, or he's the gimp for the left, which basically profits from the left being successful.
For those listeners whose pop culture knowledge may be weak, this is a reference to Pulp Fiction, 1994, directed by Quentin Tarantino. Anyway, we can continue.
Don't look it up in front of your children.
Right.
And anyway, but on the optimism, I think you're right. I mean, the optimism in most people's mind today, and kind of the degraded popular culture, means kind of this candy-colored pop, balloons popping, everybody's happy for no particular reason. It's all going to be great optimism. You can be optimistic about things, but also be aware that before you get to the sunny uplands or what have you, there's a lot of stuff you have to do and suffer through that, or at least potentially have to do and suffer. So I'm extremely optimistic, and I can get kind of depressed when I look at some of unhappy, when I look at some other people on the right who I won't necessarily name, but who are always wailing about how bad it's going to be, but don't really have any solution or plan for doing anything but complaining about it and whining about how bad it is that our enemies control everything.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you a question. So I want you to state the thesis that I then intend to dispute, but I want to hear it in your own words, both to be fair, but also so to ensure that I don't get it wrong. In your review of so you reviewed two of my books, the little blue book, as I call it, the After the Flight 93 election, and then The Stakes, which is more recent, much longer, more substantial book that came out in September of last year. And I say this not to butter you up. I say this more for the reader's edification. It was the best review of the book, not merely because it was a positive review, but because I think only you and Nathan Pinkowski in First Things really read it, engaged it, understood it, and took it on its own terms and said things about it that were, now you both liked it, so I appreciate that. But I note that it either mostly was not reviewed or it was kind of dismissed elsewhere. So I really do appreciate that. Now, you made a distinction in that review, and it's not the first time I'd seen you say it. I'd seen you say this in other things on your blog, going back to before I knew who you were. And that is this distinction between a Straussian outlook and an Augustinian outlook. And as you set them up in opposition, I think, to say, and as I recall, at an earlier time, you had accused may be the right word, maybe not, of being Straussian, which in the sense in which I mean it is true. I'm not sure it is in the sense that you mean it. And then you said in the second time, you said, now I'm not so sure, he might be kind of using Straussian surface rhetoric to cover up a deeper Augustinianism. But I want you to state in your own words what you mean by these things.
Yes, this is a correct thumbnail analysis. So I typologically view the effective right as consisting of a couple different branches, and these are two of the main branches. And by effective right, I mean I don't care about Brooks, Goldberg, all these kind of people. I mean, George W. Bush, God rot him, who has been in the news lately for various
George W. Bush, who, by the way, has a new book coming, just about to come out, on why we still need to open up all the border. I mean, can you self-parody? I mean, my God.
I've given up reviewing books simply to attack them, so I will probably not review that. I got tired of beating up on books and decided I would focus merely on books that at least had some value in them. So sadly, you'll probably not see a review of George W. Bush's latest. In any case, so my view, the division between Straussians and Augustans, the latter being from Augustus, the emperor, right, is that now I have to confess that you have forgotten far more knowledge about Leo Strauss than I know or have ever known. So I can't say that I'm interpreting Strauss, but typologically, I view Straussians generically. I understand that there's divisions within this as to where exactly the point is that we left the rails. But I view Straussians as seeing some facet or time of the American experiment being, if not the pinnacle of all possible political systems, the pinnacle of effective political systems that have existed in real life, whether that's 1787 or 1865 or some other time. In my understanding, Straussians all think it's not now, and in the past, it was at some maximum to which at least some elements of which we can return and thereby benefit our current polity. Whereas, and I would contrast that to Augustine's, again, from the Emperor Augustus, which is tied in some ways to your talk about blue Caesar and red Caesar in the States, the idea being someone like Augustus, rather than Julius Caesar, who merely technically overthrew the Republic and then died, Augustus took that power, granted, of course, that he had a long reign and various other things in his favor, and implemented a entirely new system which maintained some of the forms of the old, but instead of attempting to go back to the earlier Republican forms of governance in Rome, which at one point were very successful and obviously were no longer successful, moved forward rather than looking back. And obviously, there's not necessarily 100% division between those two things, because if you have a new thing informed by the wisdom of the old, that can be very beneficial. And that's what Augustus did. But he didn't say 350 BC, it was really awesome. We need to really focus on that and primarily go back to that time. So my view is that Straussians are crippling themselves. Maybe that's a bit of an overly strong statement, but hampering their efforts by attempting to focus overmuch on the specifics of the past rather than using what is now and gaining power, which they don't have yet, obviously, on the right, in order to implement a new vision of the future, which is not ideological, but mostly practical, but has to be informed by some set of political philosophy.
Okay, a lot to say, and since I don't want to dominate and take over, I think you're going to have to interrupt me at some point before I get through this. But I want to try to unpack and explain as much of that as possible. Much of it will be familiar to listeners of a Claremont Institute podcast, but I think it's still worth going through. First of all, the first thing I want to say is I think you should read Strauss. You'd like it. I think you'd get a lot out of it, and you'd see that actually he's a lot more complicated, subtle, and wiser than you probably think. I know I've sent you some clips from time to time, and you usually are interested in that. I think you'd have fun with it. Okay. After that, now we need to make a distinction between Strauss himself and his followers. That's sort of distinction one. And then among his followers, we have to make a distinction between broadly understood the West Coast Straussians, of which the Claremont School is the home, and the East Coast Straussians. And then after that, we have to ask ourselves, because I would say the West Coast Straussians in a certain interpretation come the closest to what you're talking about. That is this notion of political perfection, which cannot be surpassed. And that the ideal system from that point on is stasis, right? We've reached it. It's final. We've got the best regime. Let's not let it go. This is a question of which, one interpretation of West Coast Straussianism is that they think that's possible. And another would be that, they don't, but they de-emphasize the possibility of decline or loss for rhetorical purposes. Now, if our great teacher, that is all of us in Claremont's great teacher, Harry V. Jaffa, were here, I think he would hit me with a ruler for suggesting that it's possible to do any better. I mean, he wrote an article, a little monograph called "The American Founding as the Best Regime," deliberately borrowing this classical phrase, the best regime, and applying it to a modern context. Okay, but let's take these in turn. So Strauss himself wrote, 15 books, if I recall, wrote very little about America itself, a few stray comments about America. He quotes the Declaration of Independence at the beginning of Natural Right and History. In another essay in Liberalism, Ancient and Modern, he quotes Thomas Jefferson in one of his letters to Adams about the natural aristoi, that there is a natural aristocracy among men, and that government is best, which provides for the natural aristoi to occupy prominent offices and things like that. So there's this handful of very cryptic comments about America, never treats the subject thematically. And it's hard to know what Strauss actually thought about the United States we know that he was grateful to the United States for giving him refuge from persecution in Europe, for treating him well and honoring him and allowing him to do his philosophic work and train a couple generations of students who went on to be very prominent. But what he thought of it as a regime, is not clear. And my sense of the man, from having read all of his books many times, is that even if he found as a philosopher some theoretical flaw in the United States, he was much too just decent and grateful a person. He's not that, he's not like, let's say, Ilhan Omar, or the more recent breed of immigrant to the United States who likes to come over and then just trash us and tell us all how evil we are and how we don't live up to her standards and how dare we. Yeah, he's not that guy. He's the guest who, when you invite him into your home, is nothing but gracious, polite, and grateful his entire life. So even if, as an intellectual matter, he finds some problem, he's never going to say it, or he will find a way to say it so obliquely that you got to read his books with a magnifying glass to find it or figure it out. Now, the next thing I guess I would say, the one very relevant passage in Strauss that you should read if you haven't read, because it's exactly what you're talking about. It's, in fact, the single best thematic treatment of this concept that I have ever come across in any literature, and it's only about 15 pages long. So Strauss wrote one of the first books that really kind of made him famous was this little book called On Tyranny. And it's a dialogue of Xenophon's called Hiero, or On Tyranny. Hiero being a tyrant of Cicero, Syracuse, a Greek colony in Sicily. And it's a dialogue between Hiero the tyrant and Simonides the poet about the nature of tyranny. Very short, 18 pages, I think. And then Strauss takes that book and he writes 80 or 90 pages explaining this little dialogue, just this masterpiece of close interpretation. And then he asks his friend, Alexander Kojev, who's a kind of a notorious figure in many ways as being the sort of supremo philosopher of the left in the 20th century. And it appears in all likelihood also a KGB spy, but we can leave that to one side for now. And he says to Kojev, you're the only person who will understand this book. Can you review it for me? And Kojev writes this incredibly long review called Tyranny and Wisdom. And Strauss replies with the restatement on Xenophon's Hiero, all of which is then packaged together in a second edition of On Tyranny. And now the current edition, which is the one that's been in circulation for a while, has the Xenophon, Strauss's initial interpretation, Kojev's review, Strauss's reply, and then their correspondence over the course of from the 1930s to the 1960s. Here's the thing, though. In the beginning of the restatement, Kojev responds to another review by Eric Vogelin, who's fairly, I don't know, he's not nearly that well known anymore, but he is one of the few 20th century academics who's worth reading on any. I mean, most of them just fall by, they just fall away and nobody cares about them anymore. Vogelin I don't put on the same level as a lot, but you can learn something from Vogelin. And in fact, that's exactly what Strauss says in the restatement. He says, according to the most interesting responses to my piece, or at any rate, the only two from which one can learn anything. And then he goes on and he discusses Caesarism, okay, in this passage. He says,
now we're getting somewhere.
This is this doctrine of Caesarism, right? What is the doctrine of Caesarism? And Strauss says, well, it's a type of one-man rule or quasi-monarchy. It's something in between legitimate monarchy as understood by Aristotle and all the classics, and tyranny as something as condemned by all of the classics, right? So it's the way I think I tried to sum it up in my book is it's one-man rule partly justified by necessity. In other words, if the state has come to a point where it simply cannot be, a formerly Republican, small r, state has gotten to a point where it can no longer be governed in its Republican norms, then Caesarism is justified if Caesarism brings with it good government. It's not something you would choose for its own sake in a different time, but it's something you would choose in a particular time because it's better than the alternative. And, Strauss lays all of this out in a mere 12 to 15 pages. And he talks about how the ancients were perfectly well aware of this doctrine, but they never formulated, or they were well aware of the concept, but they never formulated a doctrine of it for essentially public spirited reasons. They didn't want to give would-be Caesars or, pocket Caesars, fake Caesars, people who just think that there's always, as I try to explain to my students, well, why do people write this way, this esoterically? Why do they try to hide certain doctrines? Well, if you make it clear, something that a wise man understands, like extreme times justify extreme measures, the more openly you state that, there's always going to be lots of midwit or worse people who think, I think this is an extreme and this is an extreme measure. And of course, Caesarism is justified because I'm a natural Caesar, right? You don't want to encourage bad souls, bad natures like that. So you're careful about the way they state it. Well, Strauss lays all of this out. So he's clearly aware of the problems. And we cannot, therefore, attribute to Strauss the notion of political perfection, which can be now,
but is it not the case? Isn't it the case that the people who look to Strauss as a guiding political light, and I do have a copy of On Tyranny on my on deck to reading list in that edition with all the correspondence. But isn't it the case that the group of people loosely referred to as Straussians, whether or not this idea is derived from Strauss, generally holds some variation of the opinions I ascribe to?
It is. I think that's too simplistic, but because that gets me to the sort of the second thing that I said earlier. So now we've said what we're going to say, I suppose, for now about Strauss himself on this doctrine, right? And now his students, right? Now, so Strauss, it's very clear if you read Strauss, there's a handful of fundamental themes that guide his work: philosophy versus poetry, the ancient quarrel between philosophy versus poetry, the fundamental tension or irreconcilability at theoretical level, according to Strauss, between reason and revelation, or particularly between philosophy and revelation. And finally, ancients and moderns, which he made one of his big themes. So Strauss's surface teaching, at the very least, is that there's a fundamental change in philosophy and political philosophy in the early modern world, that Machiavelli initiates a break with all prior thought, medieval and ancient. And to summarize Strauss's formula, that the Machiavelli's argument, according to Strauss, is the ancients posited a best regime, which is truly the best, but can't be realized. Or Strauss also says its realization depends on chance. It's very improbable, but it's still the best, right? You just can't, you're almost certainly never going to see it in action. And because it can't be realized, the ancients then conclude from this, one must moderate one's expectations from politics. You can't perfect, or what is it, that line in Plato's Republic, where Socrates famously says, if until and unless kings, philosophers become kings, or kings genuinely and adequately philosophize, there will be no end to the ills and evils in the cities. And since this is probably not going to happen, there's going to be, things are always going to be problematic, troublesome, not perfect, right? So we have to lower our hopes and expectations from politics. In Strauss's formula, the key to understanding modernity or early modernity is this notion that the ancients set the goal too high. If the goal is the best regime of Plato's Republic or something like that, well, then of course you're not going to be able to achieve that. But then that gives you an excuse not to really try to do much. And so philosophically, setting the bar too high then leads to a kind of practical fatalism. I'm summarizing and I'm oversimplifying, but a kind of can't win, don't try attitude. Well, since I can't achieve the best, what the hell? I'll accept all of this garbage as normal, right? Strauss says, no, the early moderns say, well, what if we lower the goal, but we make the actualization much more probable? Then all of a sudden, all these new horizons open up. Yes, we can't achieve, the ancients were right. The best regime as outlined by Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, et cetera, isn't achievable. But this new regime outlined by the early moderns, which takes as its goal not virtue and not the perfection of the human soul, and not ultimately the cultivation of philosophy and philosophers, but simple things that most people, most of the time, if not all the time, want: basic security, a basic amount of prosperity and order, and that kind of thing. These things are achievable. Now, Strauss's students, most of them take from this notion that, okay, this is what modernity is. Or to borrow a phrase that Strauss liked to use, but is actually from Winston Churchill, the modern's built on low but solid ground, right? It's lower, but it's dependable, solid. The problem with this, according to this interpretation, which comes out most clearly, most radically in Strauss's chapter on Locke in Natural Right and History, is that there's a kind of implicit esoteric hedonism embedded in the modern project. We're just looking after basically the needs of the body from this point on. We're not caring about the soul anymore. The state and political society is all going to be about security, prosperity, material plenty, and these kinds of things. But there's an emptiness at its core.
I mean, much of my own thinking that underlies this is basically an attack on the Enlightenment. And so you have Francis Bacon, the improvement of man's estate, as being the goal, the sole goal, or the overriding goal of society.
The conquest, the specific line from Bacon is that the project becomes the conquest of nature for the relief of man's estate. Right? I would say most of Strauss's students take this view. His early students, we're talking about back in the 50s and 60s, and they go further than Strauss ever did. Now, what Strauss may have said to them privately, I don't know, but it's not in the books. I can tell you that. And
are there like manuscripts circulating about what Strauss really said?
There are taped transcripts of many of his classes, which are in the process of being formalized and published on the University of Chicago website. And some of them, 3 of them, I have them back here, have already been turned into books. None of them have yet shown that Strauss, his true opinion of what America was. But anyway, what many of his students then come to the conclusion is, and this is all spelled out quite clearly in Alan Bloom's Closing the American Mind, which is the most famous Straussian book not by Strauss ever written, that became a huge mega bestseller in 1987, sold 1 million copies, and made Bloom an absolute, supernova superstar type. Bloom says, and I think he thinks he's channeling Strauss. He says what all America really is a regime based on these early modern principles of sort of Lockean natural right and implicit hedonism erected on the world stage. And so the problem is modernity. It's that lowering the goal was this terrible catastrophe for the soul of man. And now look at where we are in this bad. So those kinds, I would call them, roughly speaking, the East Coast Straussians, will disagree with you and say, no, there was no nirvana state that we can go back to. America was flawed from the beginning. It was always a problem. It was never really going to work. It was a kind of hedonistic state that worked for a while, so long as they were kind of coasting on the fumes of religiosity and virtue, but there was no way to refill the tank according to the principles of this regime. And not just America. Basically, their view is every modern regime that reinvents itself along these lines ends up in the same lane of traffic, heading in the same direction, right? So they're pessimists in that sense. Now, before I go on, you have anything you want to say there?
This is interesting in part because my familiarity with subgroups of Straussians primarily revolves around West Coast Straussians.
Right.
So your description of East Coast Straussians is not wholly new to me, but largely new to me, though you will be disappointed to hear that my immediate reaction is I resonate more with that.
Right.
No, because my entire shtick.
Well, I'm not done yet. I may win you over,
okay.
but by the time it's all over, we'll see. So from there, you get our teacher, meaning the Claremont teachers, Harry Jaffa, who's one of she's basically Strauss's first student and spends every waking hour that he can from 1945 to 1952 with Strauss, taking all of his classes, but first in New York and then in Chicago, where they, until Jaffa gets an academic job at Ohio State and has to move on. And then Jaffa is also instrumental in bringing Strauss to Claremont after the University of Chicago forcibly retired Strauss in 1967, I guess after the 67 academic year. And the story that's been told to me by a number of people is that Mrs. Strauss just hated Southern California so much that they didn't stay very long. They were only there for about a year and a half. And then they moved back east, and Strauss spent the remainder of his years at Annapolis, Maryland, and St. John's College. Okay, Jaffa's is the student of Strauss's who first decides he's going to take these principles that he's learned reading Plato's Republic and Machiavelli and so on and so forth with Strauss, apply them to America, famously applies them to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and publishes his famous book, Crisis of the House Divided, in 1959. And the early Jaffa essentially accepts that outline of modernity and America as a modern regime, essentially theory erected into a regime, Locke put into practice. As Jaffa has explained, and he's written quite a lot, it's easy to dig in and find Jaffa's own self-explanation, but in a nutshell, he says over the next 15 years, he had a change of heart and thought that, in fact, the American founding is much greater than he had originally thought. It's not simply Locke's second treatise made into a constitution and put into effect. It's much deeper than that. And the founders had to solve, or at least attempt to address, all of these political problems that no one had that had been introduced in modernity, but also in the medieval world. And because of the Roman conquest of the ancient world and because of the rise of Christianity, no one had really thought about this in such a way until the founders did. And then their achievement, Jaffa was not a humble man, to say the least. Those of us who knew him, we found his vainglory endearing and amusing. Other people, he's pretty acid penned when he wanted to be, and he wanted to be quite often. So if you were at the receiving end of one of his fusillades, you maybe didn't find his vainglory endearing and amusing. I speak only for myself as a former student and for fellow former students. He thought, Harry Jaffa, I figured all this out, right? Like, I couldn't have done it had I not done it on on a foundation that Leo Strauss gave me, which was the most fortuitous event of my life, was meeting this man in 1945. But I figured all this out. And now I understand what America is. And that's where you get the view, or at least the kernel of the view that you're talking about. Now, we need to talk about the limits of that view in a second. That's really important. But, as I said, culminating in Jaffa writing a piece for the bicentennial of the Constitution in 1987 called American Founding as the Best Regime. Like, we've solved the political problem, right? And of course, this divides. I mean, the Straussian world has already been divided by this point, but the divide just gets deeper and deeper the more Jaffa explores these lines of thought. And with the East Coast Straussians essentially saying that he's making it up, or he's over-interpreting all kinds of things and reading into the founding things that aren't there. And well, I could pause there for a second and see if you have anything, but I'm certainly have some.
No, this is very. I'm old enough that I can vaguely remember in the late 80s when I was in high school, Jaffa, there was back when National Review was a real magazine as opposed to this,
whatever
group of insane low IQ grifters. It's they used to publish. I think Jaffa published in it. I remember reading some of the stuff at the time. I mean, it was all over my head at the time because I went to a big. It was actually a fairly high end high school because it was a university high school in a university town, a public high school. But I didn't learn any of these things, and my parents were quite educated. So this is very educational. Please continue.
Well, Jaffa was extremely friendly with Bill Buckley from an early. I think they met initially on the Gold. Jaffa's his most famous act by far, when you read his obituary, is he wrote the Barry Goldwater '64 convention speech. Mm-hmm. Even though he should be famous for his and he is famous for his scholarship and so on. But if the one sentence on Harry Jaffa is, well, he wrote extremism in defense of liberty, right? Well, fair enough, and it's true. So I believe he met Buckley in that context, but I know they were friends for years afterward. And Buckley he published him all the time in National Review. He didn't so much change National Review's editorial line. I mean, Buckley had his own background of deep family friendships with various paleo-conservative types. But he let Jaffa and these guys duke it out in the pages of NR. One interesting, just as a personal aside, I say this wherever I can. It's interesting that, people where we are today on the right is there are a lot of people who think that who never studied with him. Maybe they've read one of his books or whatever, but they think they sort of understand Jaffa, as, American founding principles of the Declaration, America as an idea. And so I call it crackerjack box Claremontism. There are a lot of people out there who think they understand Harry's teaching, Professor Jaffa's teaching, they understand all of his books, and they just give you this really stupid, dumbed down view. And then they use it to attack anyone to their right who thinks, actually, I think we probably need a border wall. Oh no, America's an idea. We can't have a border wall. I learned that, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. But it's interesting. So then you got the people further to the right who are correct, let's call them the paleocons, the Pat Buchanan types, the Sam Francis types, who certainly figured out trade and immigration policy long before I personally did. Right. But then who look to someone like me and they go, oh, wait, you are one of those Claremont guys who studied with Jaffa. You're a neocon, therefore you're evil. I'm like, okay, You guys, I got morons on either side of me. But though I really I shouldn't say that about the ones over here because I'm trying to make friends with them. But you guys have to get over that. If you try to read my book, you'll realize we have so much common ground. Why do we need to fight over this stupid crap? But also you don't really understand what Jaffa was saying. My main point here, just as a personal aside, is Jaffa was extremely great friends with the people like Wilmore Kendall and Emmy Bradford, his great antagonists in the paleo, the Lincoln debates, the refighting the Civil War debates, with whom, he fought to the knife in print. But when it came to a personal friendship or phone calls or meeting, whatever, he loved these guys, got along with them great. Anyway, for what it's worth.
Well, let me interject there a kind of holistic question that I think probably matters, which is, isn't all this, I find this interesting. I find this fascinating. It's very educational for me. But isn't all of this basically inside baseball? I mean, the distinctions among these people, some of them alive, some of them dead, and so on, are very interesting and informative in creating the political philosophy of the future. But that's all it is, right? I mean, there's a danger. There's a danger. Well,
there's a danger, definitely.
Right. The danger. I mean, so I'm always nattering on about the man of destiny. My wife says basically that what I mean is myself, and that upsets her. I don't mean that at all. I'm too old, and I have too many scruples to run around doing the things that the man of destiny is no doubt going to do. But the man of destiny is going to have people who think along these lines. But whoever is in charge in the future, if we get to a decent reform society, isn't necessarily going to be an expert in these things, which doesn't mean they aren't important. But are we the people who are at least potentially the drivers of future major change, spending too much time focusing on these details?
Okay, maybe. And if anybody is, I'm definitely guilty of it. However, I have an explanation of why I think this matters. Even if a lot of the detail that I gave you doesn't matter, I was just doing it because I thought people would find it interesting. I thought you would find it
interesting. I'm not criticizing.
As we discussed off before the tape was rolling, I'm going to exaggerate for the sake of effect here. We really don't care what the listeners think of this conversation. This is pure self-indulgence for Charles and myself. So if you're bored, just turn it off. And it was nice having you for as long as we had you.
Bye. No, don't leave. Come back.
Here's why I think it matters. Because the question that you lay out in the Straussian versus Augustinian, although I think your categories are incorrect, at least on the...
I want to interject. Augustinian makes it sound like Saint Augustine.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
So just let's stick with Augustine.
Absolutely. It matters because of where are things going, right? So just as one interpretation, I happen to think it's a mistaken interpretation of Strauss, but one interpretation of Strauss is that modernity is purely a dead end, and the United States was irredeemably flawed from the beginning. It never had a chance because it had these horrible principles, right? So I think there's the mistaken interpretation of Jaffa also leads to a dead end. But the mistaken interpretation of Jaffa does drive a lot of the opposition to. So you are a guy who will say openly, I, Charles Haywood, am for an Augustan turn in American politics. I, of course, cannot say that. Whether I believe it or not, of course I don't believe it. I absolutely forswear it. I would never, or as James Q. Wilson said, I love this. This is one of my favorite essays of all time. Commentary, 1967, after the election of Reagan. Everyone in the Eastern establishment is shocked and has no idea how this happened. And they go to Harvard professor James Q. Wilson, who grew up in Long Beach, California, and was an undergrad at the University of Redlands, way out in San Bernardino County. And they say, please explain this to us. And he says, okay, I'm going to explain it. But remember, I'm just explaining how Reagan was elected governor. I don't like, I don't believe in any of this. And even if I did think like him, I would never write it down in a place where my colleagues in the Harvard faculty could find it, right? So I completely forswear Augustan politics for the United States of America. And even if I believed it were possible or desirable, I would never, ever say it aloud where any of my colleagues from Hillsdale College or the Claremont Institute could hear it. Okay, so that said, if you as an advocate are for this thing because you think it would be better, right? The primary, not maybe primary, but one of the types of opposition that you are going to face is from conservatives, I put that in air quotes, who will say, oh no, we know that the United States of America is the best regime. It's permanent, it's fixed, you can't do any better. Therefore, what you're talking about is regress, and you are bad and evil. We should be thinking about restoration of the Constitution and this and this and this and this. To which, the Charles Haywood I know and have read will say, delusional. That's insane. You guys are just out of your mind. This isn't going to happen, right? So this matters because the ultimate political question at any time is always, well, what do we do now? What do we do now, right? And I would say, going all the way back to Strauss and pre-Strauss, right? There is a thing. It's written about in my book at some length, and I've talked about it everywhere. Anybody who's ever read anything by me or heard me speak anywhere, they're probably getting tired of this. It's a broken record known as the cycle of regimes. And cycle of regimes is discussed in ancient literature, in Machiavelli, and so on. And Caesarism is, in a sense, a manifestation of the cycle of regimes, right? Caesarism is one-man rule, partially legitimized by necessity, that succeeds a formerly successful Republican regime. I think if you could sit Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, or even Leo Strauss down today, now, and get the truth out of them. Remember, they like to hide the truth in what they wrote. But if you have a private conversation where they tell you the truth, you say, Mr. Strauss, do you think the cycle of regimes can be overcome? That the United States of America, as it existed in either 1787 or 1865 or 1945 or whatever can exist in perpetuity? He would say, of course not. Even Abraham Lincoln himself would say no, right? One of Lincoln's most famous stories that he liked to tell, a sort of apocryphal thing of some wise king, not unnamed, gets his wisest men together and says, I want to make a monument, and I want to have a phrase that I can carve on this thing that will never be untrue. Words that will be permanently. So come back and think of the phrase. And the wise men go off and confer. And, they're a little worried maybe because if you come up with something the boss hates in the world, you might be decapitated. But they come back to him, and the phrase they delivered to him is, and this too shall pass away. And he loves it. He's perfect. It's absolutely, of course, true. Like nothing human will ever last forever, right? Now, Jaffa's a tougher case in the sense that I think he's wiser than he let on, and I think he rhetorically overstates a lot of his cases because he's always thinking about the battle he's in at the moment, right? But was Jaffa not wise enough to understand that even the United States of America, which he loved more than anything on this earth, right, that too would have to pass away? I don't think so. I think Jaffa, no, I don't think somebody could have spent 7 years with Leo Strauss reading Plato and Aristotle at the depth that Harry Jaffa did and come away from that believing, no, we have fundamentally solved the political problem and this regime will be perpetual and universal. I don't buy it. I think he thought that for the time being, it was worth fighting for. It needed to be fought for, and that any kind of rhetorical concession that it may be passing away is just giving aid and comfort to enemies and dispiriting people on his own side. And so he's like, in a way, he was both the philosopher and he was kind of the morale officer in the spiritual war. Buck up and fight.
Well, that's actually very interesting in the sense that it explains kind of where some of my own thinking comes from. But if that's true, I mean, you talk frequently from Machiavelli about new modes and orders, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I'm totally down with the cycle of regimes and everything passing away. But new modes and orders result, of course, just generically speaking, from two things: that things change. For example, modern technology is radically different than previous technology. And I am a strong disbeliever in the singularity and strong AI and these various things. But technology does allow certain things that were never even possible to contemplate in the past. And of course, you have new modes and orders because the nature of the polity of the people, the virtue of the aristoi, what have you, changes. And so you can't necessarily, between those two things, you're going to have a cycle. And it seems to me that historically, this cycle identified in Polybius and so on is generally the case. But from our perspective, what does that imply for the immediate future for us? Because I think both of our premise, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, so correct me if you disagree, but we currently live in a clown society that cannot possibly continue for particularly much longer, even with the help of technology. That is, you have lots of people who say America is going to be some variation on the Chinese state where woke capital will monitor us all and so on. Woke capital can do a very limited amount of monitoring, but just simply isn't capable enough and elevates the incompetent as well of administering a totalitarian society here. So what does that imply for our immediate future? And what would someone like Jaffa say if you asked him, yes, I know that you really didn't think it was going to last forever. What does that mean for America in 2021?
Okay, you asked what Jaffa would do in this circumstance. I don't want to speak for him, but I'm going to attempt to anyway. That is to say, because I make no pretense to saying I know, but having known him, this is what I think he would say in this circumstance. Now, I'm going to read you a brief passage from the last chapter of Natural Right and History by Leo Strauss. It's in the context of Edmund Burke. He's writing about Edmund Burke, and he's criticizing Burke here. Burke comes close to suggesting that to oppose a thoroughly evil current in human affairs is perverse if that current is sufficiently powerful. He is oblivious of the nobility of last-ditch resistance. He does not consider that in a way in which no man can foresee resistance in a forlorn position to the enemies of mankind, quote, going down with guns blazing and flags flying, unquote, may contribute greatly toward keeping awake the recollection of the immense loss sustained by mankind, may inspire and strengthen the desire and hope for its recovery, and may become a beacon for those who humbly carry on the works of humanity in a seemingly endless valley of darkness and destruction. He does not consider this because he is too certain that man can know whether a cost lost now is lost forever, or that man can understand sufficiently the meaning of a providential dispensation as distinguished from the moral law. Jaffa would want to be, in my estimation, that guy, the last guy on the deck as the ship goes down, flags flying and guns blazing. Even if he knew it was a forlorn position, he had a quality of soul, a spiritedness, a thymos in him that he would be that's where he would want to be as just a matter of soul. I don't know how else to put it. That's where he would want to be.
How much thymos is there? Like if you're traveling, let's say you decide to go from where you are now, which is near DC, I imagine, and you travel cross country and you just kind of take a random walk, so looping back and forth, not necessarily a straight line across the country, and you talk to people who are honest with you. Obviously we're going to leave aside the left-wing types on the coasts and the people, various Karens, mask-wearing Karens you see everywhere. You're just not going to talk to them. You're going to talk to other people. And are you going to find a lot of thymos? Are you going to find a lot of people with government checks, opioid addictions, unemployment, despair? Like Poulos would say, eat the bugs, live in the pod. I mean, what are you going to find? And what does that imply?
Look, I answered narrowly. You said, what would Jaffa, where would he want? He would want to defend.
I'm expanding now.
He would want to defend the U.S. constitutional order to the last ditch as something that even if he knew the light was going out for now, he would hope for and look forward to a revival someday in some way that he couldn't see because it could happen long after his death. But he would want the actions taken now by himself and by some cadre around him to be a beacon for that in the future, even if, as I said, he knows for now it's over.
I'm down with that, certainly.
Jaffa himself, I don't think, like, if I could have him talk to you, I don't think it's all but inconceivable to me that Jaffa would ever say to anyone, yeah, you're right, Caesarism is the best option right now. I just can't. Maybe, who knows? He could surprise you, but that doesn't sound like the man I knew.
Well, here's a sub variation on the question. So we talk about Caesarism or Augustinism as though it were a unitary permanent thing. In a sense, that falls into the error of thinking you were identifying earlier, of thinking that anything is permanent. Yeah. And Caesarism is either a solution to the current problem or an implementation of a better system. But it's not necessarily both. That is, you can imagine Caesarism followed by something that's more of a mixed government, thus kind of continuing the cycle of regimes. So in my own personal opinion, not being as kind of detailed philosophically, that's probably is one of the attractions of Caesarism, is that it cuts the Gordian knot. Right now, we have this clown show. Caesarism, despite the enormous costs and risks associated with it, is the only solution that cleanly executes something swiftly that can lead into a renewed cycle of regimes.
I'll think back to the original case or the namesake case, let's put it that way, of Caesarism, right? It solves a particular problem at the time. There's no question about that. Rome cannot govern itself as a republic anymore. In fact, this becomes the butt of jokes throughout. It's like a joke in, just to pick two off the top of my head, the BBC's I, Claudius, based on the Robert Graves book, the famous masterpiece theater that my parents were watching in the 70s. I ended up buying it decades later on DVD and watch it. And there's a point at which, Claudius himself, played by Derek Jacobi, says, now's the time is ripe. We're going to restore the Republic. And it's his prostitute wife, Messalina, who laughs in his face and says, the Republic? Nobody wants the Republic anymore. And she's right. And he's wrong. Or just the other day, I was in the kitchen cooking. I always have the TV on in the background while I'm cooking. And there's Russell Crowe's Gladiator. I'm like, I haven't seen this in a while. And then they get Richard Harris as Marcus Aurelius, ahistorically, when he has to break it to his son Commodus that he's not going to be emperor. By the way, that's utterly ahistorical because Marcus's worst decision of his life was to choose Commodus as his successor. But leaving that aside, he says, well, we're going back to the Republic. I'm like, it's a joke. This is Plutarch's judgment of Cicero. If anyone wants to read it, is that Cicero's running around thinking he can restore something that can't be restored at this point. It's too late, right? So it solves that immediate problem. Now, here's the part where it gets maybe a little spicy, right? But this is factually accurate, right? To be an ordinary citizen in Rome, I allow you to choose. Do you want to be alive in 100 AD or in 200 BC? Well, in terms of Republican virtue and political strength and so on, 200 BC, right after the Battle of Zama, the victory in the Second Punic War, is the peak of Rome, absolutely the peak of Rome. To actually live in Rome and your day-to-day life standard of living, exposure to crime, income, quality of life, 100 AD, hands down, no question whatsoever. But there's no political freedom, right? You might even be a Roman citizen, which has some advantages, but you go about your business. You have no say in your government. There's no, that Hegelian sense of recognition that you get from being an equal or one of the partners in the government is absent, right? It's you are ruled, pure and simple, period. But all of everything that we read in Roman literature, I see, you can see my lobes behind me. I see sometimes when your head moves, you have even more lobes behind you in that bookshelf back there. All that literature, none of it's written during the healthy Republican period. It's all written in the decadent imperial period. All the architecture, the statues and everything, maybe not all, but most of it. I mean, since we've been talking about Augustus famously said, I found it a city of wood. I left it a city of marble, right? The glories of Rome that we think about all came later. Now, therefore, if one wants to be optimistic, one might say, if the United States were to transfer or transition to Caesarism, does that mean that some golden age in arts, literature, and architecture would follow? That sounds even too crazy optimistic for me. But even then, so Rome makes the transition. It solves a particular problem. It actually leads to many improvements in many ways, civilizational and just material, right? And in a sense, political. I mean, it's better. The first century BC is civil war and constant civil war and proscriptions. Who would want to live through that? I mean, it's interesting, but I like reading about it. I don't think I would want to have lived through it, though. And whereas the first century AD is quite boring to live through politically, with a handful of Caligula's and his horse and these kinds of things. But it's especially after you get through the Julio Claudians and into the Antonines, everything's nice and smooth, right? Running it's dull.
I don't think this is spicy at all. I mean, there's a basic confusion you see in kind of public discourse today that confuses the rule of law with participation in governance. That is, the average person shouldn't really be concerned with politics. I'm not familiar with the Hegelian reference you make, and there is probably an argument that there are some set of people in a situation like that who want to be involved in politics but can't. But the average human being wants the rule of law within some reasonable set of expectations. That is, you could have the rule of law with low-level occasional bribery or nepotism and things like that. Yeah. He's never going to have it perfect, and decent opportunities for his children and safety for his children. And he doesn't really care. Augustus, for example, was famous for not being a jerk. My favorite story about that is that after the Battle of Actium, this merchant came to him and he had a parrot that said, "Hail Caesar, Victor Imperator." And so Caesar was very impressed. So Augustus was very impressed, and gave him 500 denarii. And then he came to learn that the same merchant had a different bird that said, "Hail Antony, Victor Imperator." And he also, instead of being mad, he paid him 500 denarii for that bird too, which obviously makes you, that's the kind of society you want to live in, where the guy in charge isn't a jerk looking to chop off your head, but takes a joke as a joke without putting a political
this leads us on a tangent, which I don't want to go down at the moment, which is one of the inherent weaknesses of any form of one-man rule, whether it's hereditary monarchy, whether it's elective monarchy, whether it's Caesarism or whatever, is you could get jerks, as Montesquieu says, and you're very likely to get jerks from time to time. Montesquieu says at one point in his another wonderful book, I highly recommend you read if you haven't read it. It's nice and short, called Considerations on the Grandeur of the Romans and their Decadence.
Yes, I have a review.
Oh, you do? Okay, I need to read that. I actually, no, you're right. I did read that review. I remember that now that you mentioned it. Sorry.
It was one of the earlier ones, so shorter and less ranty than some of the later ones.
He says at one point, it seems like all of this striving throughout Roman history, this conquest and this building, turns out to have been all for the sake of just putting it all into the hands of 3 or 4 monsters. That is a major problem with this kind of, and it's all right.
We're governed by monsters now. They're more diffuse.
When you said, this isn't, what I mean about spicy is that believe me, I'm more at risk of this than you are. But anytime I say anything doubtful about, well, I don't know, maybe the trajectory we're on isn't particularly healthy. Maybe some bad thing could happen. I will inevitably get accused of wishing for it. I will inevitably be accused of betraying the U.S. constitutional system or not believing in it anymore or something like that, and being an advocate of a thing that I don't even necessarily predict is coming next, but that I speculate may come next. And so even to say something like, just to make the factual observation, both material and cultural life in Rome improved after the advent of Caesarism from where it had been before that, I guarantee you 50 conservatives are going to come out and say, oh, he's a fascist and he's wishing for this. They will. That's just what they do. They're just looking around to find little stupid things to nitpick and mischaracterize. But it just shows you what a kind of pack of jackals the entire intellectual right has become.
Yeah, but is anyone listening? I mean, the reality is, and I don't mean to turn this into beating up on National Review conservatives.
Because, because I'm working on a long piece to beat up National Review, which I eventually will finish.
I won't steal your thunder, but I mean, those people don't matter. I mean, they're like barnacles on the ship of history. I mean, they're just worthless, and so it doesn't really matter if they spend their time attacking you, unless they, of course, can take away your employment or your house or what have you. But the reality is that your enemies aren't so much those people; they're just kind of nattering at you. It seems to me. I mean, I understand that they're going to do that, and they're not going to. And if they read what I have to write, then they'd be probably truly appalled because I come closer to advocating for those things. But that doesn't strike me as. I mean, how many years have you been attacked publicly now?
5.
4 and a half.
Four and a half, roughly. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, we're almost at 5.
Right. Okay. Isn't your reaction asymptotically approaching indifference?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm a little too thumotic for that. I mean, I'm mostly indifferent, but sometimes, sometimes people just make me mad. Or I also get, this is the sort of I don't know exactly how one would characterize this, but if I read an argument that's an attack on me, or it could be on anything that I know is bad, and I know I have an answer, I'm like that, that old cartoon. It's like, come to bed. And there's a dude at the keyboard. He goes, I can't, someone is wrong on the internet. Like, if I see this argument and if I can see through it and I know what it is, I want to just go after it. Like, I'm going to take this down. Like, and when a more rational person, third party, such as yourself, would say, Mike, that doesn't matter. And I'll be like, but I have an answer.
It seems to me that a lot of what we do that is in terms of educating ourselves, educating other people. I mean, your students, people who are adults who are listening to this, for example, I've learned a lot about Strauss and Straussians today. Depends on what the future holds, right? I mean, if we continue in this clown society holding pattern for the next 20 years, you and I are going to be old and nothing will have really accomplished. And that's not particularly productive. But if things change, and my entire thesis is that things are likely to change rapidly in the near future, then it strikes me as very valuable, because at that point, a lot of the people who spend their time on Twitter, for example, offering hot takes will disappear. They're ephemeral, right? These things are useful, but they're only useful if we have a major societal change, because the reality is that people don't spend a lot of their time on other types of ephemera and not focused on this. But there's a small group who focuses on things like this.
I don't know. I guess the caveat I would interject there is, even if, let's say, we don't get major societal change in the next 20 years, somebody has to keep these thoughts and the teaching alive and the books alive. And so that's, sometimes I view myself, as a monk. I'm not a monk. I actually am married and I talk and so on. But you need some cadre, because since we don't know what's going to happen or when it's going to happen, we need some cadre of people who are well versed in these things to keep it going. And then, getting back to that quote I read from Natural Right and History, in a sense, to inspire, keep the flame alive. And at some point, people will be ready, or there will be an opening, but you don't want to have everybody then completely reinvent the wheel. Or you want them to know and have a firm basis for what, So it's what I try to balance my time in life. Now, I'm a college professor, and the president of my college, when he hired me, said very bluntly, the core mission of a college is to teach. So you can write and you can do what you want, but that's not your job. This is not a think tank job. You're not supposed to just go on TV and be writing magazine articles and treat your classes as an afterthought. It's this other stuff that's secondary. Your classes are the primary. I took that very much to heart and try to take it seriously while trying to do both, while trying to stay in both worlds. But it's very hard to know. At least I always find it difficult to figure out what's the best use of just speaking only for myself. What's the best use of my time in the here and now, right? So teaching a bunch of students, we know what good that does down the road, and I don't have any confusion about that. But like, what's the next article I should write? What's where can we actually make headway? And I very often get like exactly what you described as we opened to this conversation. I just look at it and I go, well, I'm looking at the chessboard, and they've got they don't even have 16 pieces on the board. They've got like 32 pieces on the board, and I got one pawn. Like, what the hell am I supposed to do? And sometimes it makes me just go, there's nothing. I guess I'm just going to go read a book or write a commentary on Machiavelli or something.
Well, I think it can be depressing. But I think the basic principle, of course, is the future is unknowable, except for not just all things pass, but that things change very rapidly when they do change. And I think I've told you this story before, but my grandfather, who I was very close to, died at almost 100 in 1997. He was born in 1901 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and died in the United States. So he basically saw the entire 20th century and could never have predicted anything in his life. Yeah. I mean, it was a very up and down life, and he had a lot of struggles, and it turned out okay for him in the end. And he was a very optimistic guy, which I am in some ways, though really I'm a different kind of optimism. But let me ask you a different political philosophy question, back to the Straussians and Jaffa, which is that I'm a big fan of, for lack of a better term, futurism. That is, I think that the conquest of space, asteroid mining, and those things are outstanding, excellent societal goals. But that's not really my question. My question is, a society that accomplishes these things is necessarily going to be a rich society.
Yeah.
And you're big on a whole wide range of political thinkers. Is it possible to have a super wealthy society that has any significant level of virtue and therefore is a successful society? With the premise being an unvirtuous society, or at least one without a virtuous ruling class, can't be a successful society.
Yeah, okay. The way I would answer that is, it's from what I have read of history and what the analysts, the philosophic analysts of history seem to indicate, is that there's a negative correlation between wealth and virtue, or that this is one of the drivers of the cycle of regimes, right? As Machiavelli says, virtue gives birth to quiet, quiet to leisure, leisure to disorder. Right. So it is virtue that allows you to become strong and build up wealth. And then for a time, there's a sufficient amount of, to use 20th century terminology, social capital, accumulated social capital behind that. So that the wealth masks, but you start spending it down. You're not accumulating it anymore. And once it's gone, or it can only be rebuilt when the cycle restarts and necessity reimposes. I was going to say reimposes virtue, but that's wrong. Necessity reimposes the type of actions that lead to a more virtuous society. We will, humanity, whatever happens in this clown regime, however it ends. All right, I'm fundamentally optimistic about the future of humanity. I don't expect us to become permanent bugmen, last men types for all time, for generations or thousands. I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, I agree with you, and I get into this argument a lot with people, is how long can they keep this going? They meaning the regime. I don't know, but I don't even know how we would define what is long versus short. But I don't expect Clown West to be around in 100 years. I don't even expect it to be around in 50 years. 20, easier to see. But also, I wouldn't be shocked if it blew up this year or next year or in 5 years. So, and then the cycle restarts and virtue is reborn out of necessity. Right. All the philosophers that I read are quite clear on this. And this is in a way where some of that classical fatalism comes from. Now, that's an unfair way to characterize it. They're not fatalistic. They do believe in doing what can be done in a time. But they do say, you don't expect perfection and don't expect permanence. So getting back again to something you said earlier, when you said we're having this discussion about all these flavors of Straussianism and what relevance does it matter? All right. Well, let me answer that in the following way. And that's an answer I've used before, so I'll use it again.
Oldie but a goodie.
Whatever happens, however a clown regime ends, whether it's a bang or a whimper, whether it's a kind of gradual disintegration or just a sudden collapse, whether it's today, tomorrow, 5 years, 10 years, right? Whatever happens, unless there's some massive pandemic or a meteor strike, there will be people alive on the North American continent. If Aristotle is correct, as I think he is, that human beings cannot live well without living together, that means there will be some form of political organization reasserting itself. How are we going to do that? How will those people reorganize themselves? And that is fundamentally a question of political philosophy. So, when I had a similar conversation with Curtis Yarvin not long ago, he said at one point, well, we got to, forget all this philosophy. It doesn't matter. We have to just be thinking more basically. And I said, well, you can't think basically. As soon as you say, what do I do now? There's a philosophic premise behind that question, because whatever answer you come up with, I will do X rather than Y. You've evaluated X versus Y on the basis of better and worse. And there's a philosophic presupposition there, even if it's not articulated. So when it's like, oh my God, the regime is gone, but we're still alive. We need to eat. We need shelter. We need this. We need these security. We need these we're going to organize ourselves. We're going to be asking these basic questions of political philosophy. So the first thing I would say is I would sort of take the classical line in a sense on the following sense is, okay, our goal should not be the best regime that lasts forever, because we can't do that. You are going to still be subject to, as I said too on that podcast, and no one's canceled me for it yet, so maybe I'll say it again. Even Hitler said his Reich was only going to last 1,000 years. In that sense, compared to certain philosophers, perhaps, Hitler was a modest man. Only now, granted, he missed the mark by 988 years, but still, 1,000-year Reich implies I can't make anything last forever, right? So we can't make whatever comes next last forever. The goal should be as good as it can be for as long as it can be. And I think that getting back to your initial question here, that correlation between wealth and there's a correlation between virtue and wealth, and then a correlation between wealth and decadence. I don't see that as escapable for the human race. So we reorganize. The thing ends. We reorganize on the North American continent. Charles and I are alive, and people come to us as oracles and say, "What do we do?" And we say, "Here are the sacred." It's
going to be awesome. I can.
Here are the sacred texts. Read these and found yourself on this basis. And they go, oh, "This is genius. This is awesome, man. I'm going to do all of this stuff, right?" And they succeed. And then they start building up social capital and monetary capital and industrial, and it works. And then they get richer, and as they get richer, their lives get easier. And it's just all gonna happen again, I think.
I totally agree. It's all going to happen again. But what I am fascinated by is, and I don't want to overstate this because in many ways there is no thing new under the sun, but it is also true that modern technological capabilities create something that's qualitatively new. And you don't want to exaggerate that. And I don't want to say we're all going to run out into space next week. But it is also true that if we had spent the past, I just read recently that the Department of Education has spent more than $1 trillion since its formation to accomplish literally, well, not nothing, something less than nothing, something highly negative.
Yeah.
So if we had focused as a society over the past 40 years on accomplishing things in that area, perhaps we would be somewhere. So I like to think, and I have mixed mind about Elon Musk because I think he's both a grifter and a visionary. And I'm curious what you think about Elon Musk. I'd like to think that that's a potential way out of this cycle. That is, maybe not a permanent way out of the cycle, but that the people can maintain wealth, but at the same time have new challenges, new frontiers, not to sound all Star Trekky. And that might provide a way to have it both things for a longer period of time. Not forever, as you say, because that's the way it works.
I mean, so I take everything always back to Machiavelli, I guess, because a man with a hammer sees everything as a nail. So it's this book I know the best. On the other hand, I defend myself by saying I chose that book because it is so comprehensive, and whatever you're talking about, there's some relevance, right? So Machiavelli addresses this problem. How do you perpetuate? Is it possible to overcome the cycle? And he seems to say, now, whether he really believes this, if you were to read the book super carefully, I've never figured out. But he does seem to say that, you can overcome the cycle. And most famously discusses this in Discourses, Book 3, Chapter 1. How do you, and which is all about a regime or a sect or body that wishes to perpetuate itself must return often to its beginnings. And by its beginnings, he means a kind of primal fear or terror. You need, in other words, you've got to purge out of the spirits of the people that comfort that comes with peace and wealth. And the solution that he proposes is not one that I think a lot of people will want, which is, you do some very spectacularly bloody public executions, really horrible stuff every 10 years or so to scare the living hell out of everybody who's left alive. And he does say too, it's better if the person or persons who suffer from it actually had it coming for some crime. But the necessity of the effect that you're trying to produce is so important that if you don't have somebody who's actually guilty, you just kind of have to find a way to do it anyway. And if the people you go after are innocent, well, it sucks for them, but there is, after all, common good, and a great many others are benefited, and that's just the way it goes. Now, how many people are going to raise their hands for such a solution? It's not that, or as Strauss even puts it, he says Machiavelli at one point in his essay, What is Political Philosophy? He says Machiavelli's scheme had to be modified because of its, quote, revolting character, unquote. I think he's referring to that.
So in fairness, there are people who would buy into, like the old Bolsheviks were famous for buying into the necessity for them to be executed, even though they knew all the charges were false, simply because the party was always right and this was for the greater good. So you can actually get people to buy into that, but probably they're thin on the ground.
A second Machiavellian thought here that's applicable to what we're talking about is he says, he doesn't say this, but he basically conveys the thought that if, which I'm sure you as a business person and someone, I think you went to business school too, right?
I did. I have degrees. I regret to say separate law and business degrees from the University of Chicago, which keep issuing woke pronouncements, which I keep attacking on Twitter.
Supposedly the last serious elite American university, and is not anymore. Anyway, it's a business adage, correct me if I'm wrong, if you're not expanding, you're shrinking or you're dying, right? Machiavelli doesn't say that exactly, but he seems to posit something like that for politics. If you're not expanding, you're shrinking. And so if you look at American history, as long as there was a frontier, even as the country is getting richer and more technologically advanced, but as long as you're expanding, right? Okay, so the frontier is announced closed whenever it is. I forgot the year. I used to know, 1880 something after the Civil War.
Like that, yeah.
But as long as then it becomes an expansion of the United States, of the economy, of its dominant position in world affairs and something like that. So if you're going to pick, I would say 1945 is a rough parallel in a way to 202 BC for Rome, although I don't believe we have another couple hundred years to run, but we'll see. Where you kind of done all you can, right? You've reached the peak. From that point on, Machiavelli's clear, like Rome is contracting. Spiritually, it's contracting, even though they do conquer more territory and they do get richer. But a lot of people, well, maybe not a lot, but some people were saying this exactly as you said about space for this reason. Okay, we've got to keep going. There's nowhere to go on this earth, but for our own spiritual, we got to keep going. And so the space race gives us a purpose. I believe the end of the Cold War was actually bad for Americans spiritually, that it kept them on their toes in a certain way. It was really also very bad for the state of California, which had so many Cold War industries. Not just because the aerospace plants closed, although that certainly was a direct economic effect, and the military base closures and things. But there, any political philosopher or poet can tell you, there's some value to a foreign threat to keep you on your toes, just as there is some value to this notion of continuing on, even if it is out into space. And if we're not doing that, then you're shrinking, you're dialing back, you're rolling back.
So I'll look at this always through the prism of my children. So I have a bunch of children and none of them are adults yet. And so I look at this, I'm like, well, what are their opportunities? And right now, their opportunities are crap as far as I can see, even whatever their talents are. And they have very widely differing talents, and some of them are too young to really see. But this this several decades old credential society where we all go to Stanford or Harvard or what have you, and we get a credential and we join the professional managerial elite.
Yeah.
I mean, who's sensible wants that for his children now? So,
I think all of Blue America still wants that for their children.
Oh, that's why I said who's sensible. Right?
Well, okay, good.
And so, no doubt many people desire this for children. In fact, I know many such people. But I look at one of my children is very interested in computers, and that's a fairly technical thing. But the ones who don't have a technical interest, I mean, I'm not going to send them to college so they can get indoctrinated in this kind of stuff. So that's kind of why I have this focus on sooner rather than later. And so it worries me in the sense that this thing kind of woke utopia, as I think you call it in the States. And by the way, a side plug, both for the book, but also you mentioned the impact of the Cold War in California. I think your incisive explanation of current California as future United States is worth reading the book for, if not as well for all the other stuff in the book. But you look at the Cold War, and other people have drawn this. This is not original to me, but it's obvious in retrospect in the late 1980s, given where the Soviet system was, that it was just waiting to collapse. And you see the same kind of indicia in Blue America now. Even with all the power and so on, there's nothing new there. It's all just gerontocracy, repetition of the same things and so on, which makes me hopeful that it will go away soon. I mean, this morning I published a review on Yevgeny Zamyatin's We. Have you ever heard of that book?
No.
So it was written in 1921, but not published until somewhat later. So early on in the Bolshevik era by a Russian guy named Zamyatin, influenced both 1984 and Brave New World. But it's this dystopia about the future. So I go on in there in some length that we have this kind of tyrannical and criminal regime, but I just keep coming back to, I think it's going to collapse sooner rather than later. I don't really have any proof of that, but I just don't see it. It's just so depressing otherwise if it's not going to collapse sooner rather than later, because you and I are getting older one day at a time, and it's just kind of painful to see. And then we have our children.
Well, they seem to be defying the laws of gravity in ways that should be impossible. Economic gravity, political gravity, just basic public order is now under assault everywhere with elite encouragement. It's not even elite indifference or elite approval. It's elite encouragement. It's sometimes even elite instigation. These guys, the famous Herb Stein, anything that can't go on forever won't. It seems to be this entire society is a thing that can't go on forever. And yet on it goes. But how much of that is just the spending down of accumulated capital? None of it is being replenished. And, the last little thing could just, I told this story to a class of students, not my students, but somebody asked me to talk to their class recently. And I had remembered reading business biographies, both of Rupert Murdoch and Donald Trump. And almost the same thing happened to both of them in like 90 or 91 during that recession, where they had these huge empires built on debt. The debt was incredibly complicated, and it came from all these different sources, bank after bank after bank, and it's all rigged together. This kind of, it looks like, that scene in A Christmas Story where they plug in the Christmas tree into an outlet that has like 50 plugs running off this one outlet. Look, it kind of like that. And out of the blue, in both cases, one little regional bank in like Dubuque or Pittsburgh or something with one of the smallest notes in the whole debt empire, they decide to call it. The last thing you would think happened, you think I'd be in much more trouble with my big creditors in London or New York or whatever. Instead, it's just like bank manager of the whatever. And he's like, no, I don't know about this. And almost the entire thing, in both cases, the entire thing almost comes apart over that. Like that's what almost end. Yeah. It could be something like that. You never know. We're expecting something big or foreseeable, and instead it's just right.
I mean,
little
my
thing
focus,
could just pop this.
I mean, if you're in the prognostication business, which I'm not, people would point to say China, like a war with China, where we lose in the South China Sea because we're stupid and woke, and they've been busy building up their military and anti-ship ballistic missiles. But you're right, it could be something much smaller and more constrained. I just find it all fascinating, but it just, I don't have any good answers. So,
by the way, I also wonder, I ask this question all the time. What do we owe China? $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion? Who knows? I don't even know. But if I'm China, and I'm probably not dumb enough to think I'm going to get it all back from a country this decrepit, but as long as they're meeting the interest payments, right? Do you really want to? No, maybe I'll stop. I've heard that they have stopped. They don't buy U.S. Treasuries anymore, which
Interesting.
Probably wise on their part. But if I'm China, like, do I want to give the United States a hard push right now? Or am I just like, I actually want to avoid a fight with him because I'm worried I'm going to send him to the ER or kill him?
Well, I probably shouldn't recommend this book to you because you'll be depressed. But the author, Lionel Shriver, who I think is British, wrote a book called The Mandibles.
That's right.
She occasionally makes, cancels. She occasionally makes statements that people try to cancel her for and fail because she doesn't care.
I've heard of this book, but not read it.
The Mandibles. So it's a dystopia written in like 2049, where basically the Chinese government calls the money. And in the United States is farther along the road to woke utopia and general Californization. And what happens is the country, in essence, slides into Venezuela. I mean, it's not a very realistic book in some ways, in part because it grossly understates the role of firearms in America.
Yeah.
Coming from an English author, she doesn't seem to understand that there's not going to be a lot of random crime when everyone has a gun. People are just going to stay in their homes. But if you want to be depressed, you can read that book because it doesn't really end well.
Yeah, that leads me to another thought, which is right now the regime is one of the real things that makes this regime, I think, demonic. Is it's powerful enough to ensure that policing doesn't happen, or that's an exaggeration, but that the effectiveness of policing goes down, that crime goes up, but it also still has enough power to punish you for self-defense. Mm-hmm. Right, that's the one thing it takes very seriously. It will whip up frenzied mobs to go out like Visigoths and destroy cities. If you so much as raise your fist to defend yourself, you're going to jail. Right? I mean, that's a complete inversion of what government is supposed to be for, according to the American founders and according to any conception of justice that you can name. And as long as they have the power to do something like that, I think there's a problem. But when the state can no longer do that, I think you're probably right that people will just start defending themselves and some kind of spontaneous order will emerge. But right now, the state, one of its only functions that it takes seriously is the punishment of people who defend themselves.
I think that's true, but I think it's also important to note that the episodes that have been true for that in the past 6 to 9 months have all been in places where the justice system, if it has the right to that name, has been captured by the left. That is, in most areas, in many areas of the country, including, say, where I live, that would probably not happen. Now, that doesn't mean I can go around lighting up people with a gun, but it does mean that the places where that happens, where the rule of law has completely fallen apart, are the ones that are wholly dominated by the left. Now, it is also true that the federal government will get involved if the local government doesn't adequately toe the left line. So that's its own set of problems. But I think you haven't seen that spread completely nationwide yet. And maybe you will, maybe you won't. And that's somewhat worrying. But
it is worrying. I do worry about it. I'd like to be, I want to be confident in rural, local sheriffs in red areas that they'll stand. And so we've seen some signs that they will, but we've also seen some signs that some of them won't. And for some, it's probably just a calculation of what's the state capital going to do to me and what are the feds going to do to me. So as long as right now, I totally agree with you. The break could happen at any moment. We could wake up, tomorrow and everything's fundamentally changed. But right now, the way to bet for the next 24 hours is they're still, take it day to day. They're still in power. They still, right. If you're going to make a life decision yourself on, is today the day the regime cracks? So can I get away with a little defiance? The answer is no, don't do that, because they still can crush you.
Right. My theory is that defiance is wasted energy because you're going to get maximum benefit later. Though, of course, you can extend that principle indefinitely until you're dead. That's kind of lazy and cowardly. But here's a question for you. If all this is true, why hasn't Elon Musk been canceled? Right. I don't think Elon Musk is particularly right wing, but he's pretty much definitely not left wing. And I'd be shocked if the management of his enterprises is adequately diverse, for example. So why hasn't Elon Musk come under more government attack?
Very good question. I don't know the answer. I mean, doesn't a lot of what he does involve government financing and
yes, so his space stuff is, I think, a lot of government. So maybe it's just that the right people in government.
Yeah, that could be it. I mean, it's hard to cancel somebody that rich and that prominent. So you could say, well, why hasn't Peter Thiel been canceled? Well, he hasn't. You can't cancel Peter Thiel. But look, they made his life in the Bay Area where he was a tech god for decades, so unpleasant that he left, right?
Yeah.
That's not cancellation, but it shows that they can exert enough pressure if they don't
And he's
like
still
you.
on the Facebook. He's still on the Facebook board, but as far as I know, he doesn't make pronouncements, right?
Yeah, he's still on the Facebook to book board, and as far as I know, that's personal gratitude from Zuckerberg, who Thiel was his angel investor when Zuckerberg was. I don't even think Zuckerberg had yet dropped out of Harvard, or maybe he just had.
Zuckerberg still has voting control of Facebook through multi-class shares, so I mean he can do that if he wants. But those are the only two prominent people who are that rich who are anywhere on the right, and neither of them. And I don't know if Elon Musk is on the right, but neither of them is a huge booster of things on the right, for lack of a better term. Maybe Thiel is to a certain extent. He shows up at events and so on.
Yeah, not huge, but he's at least sympathetic and he does certain things. Look, it also I think would depend on how far one of them, if it became clear that one or the other of them was getting seriously behind some kind of either political, intellectual, or any kind of real threat to the regime, I think they'd go after them a lot more. So probably part of the answer is that each of them, for precisely the reasons we're talking about, decides to be a bit careful. Now, they're not 100, they're not recluses and they're not silent. Every once in a while, you see Thiel give an interview in which he challenges some, right? Mm-hmm. But then, maybe they limit how far they're willing to go for precisely these reasons. Yeah, which shows that. Yeah,
you predicted in the stakes. You didn't really talk about rich people. You talked more about the average person. I guess it was in the Flight 93 and the Flight 93 restatement, the woke utopia, basically reign of terror that would result if Hillary won.
Yeah.
So we look around now, we've got it. Joe. Well, right. To what extent do you think and this is when I was reviewing some of these reviews before we did this, is that really, we have that now, but we have it more in the sense of the mob rule, at least over the past couple of months, and less in the sense of the government taking specific actions since Joe Biden has come into place. And maybe they're just gearing up for stuff. Like I would have thought there would be a big push for gun confiscation already. And there hasn't been much of anything, for example.
There hasn't been. Okay, it hasn't been that. But some of it is the government is happy to rely on corporations to do this for them, which is both more effective and it means that they take the heat and the government doesn't. They are gearing up a whole bunch of stuff, though. Look at the way they're having the DOE push critical race theory in K-12 everywhere. Mm-hmm. In well beyond what was even going on in the Obama administration or what was going on quietly before Trump figured it out and tried to stop it. Look at what they're doing on this affirmatively furthering fair housing stuff as a tax on suburbs. And they are implementing the woke agenda, I think, in pretty much the way that I thought. Look at a lot of Biden's, many of the people he's appointed to cabinet and sub-cabinet positions where you can't even get Republican opposition to people who have written completely outrageous things over the years. Republicans are like, I guess, he deserves his own choices and this kind of thing. So I think we're going to have a federal government that's more psychotically woke than anything we've ever seen. There's no question we're going to have than anything we've ever seen before. And it's already being built as we speak. And exactly how they use that power, I think we can guess. We know what they're going to do. It's going to be two-tier law enforcement, where if you're a regime friend, you get favorable treatment and or a pass if you do something wrong. And if you're a regime enemy, you get crushed if you do something wrong and harassed or worse, even if you on stupid technicalities. I think we're going to see more and more and more of this.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to me, you touch on the biggest kind of practical problem, which is the uselessness of the Republican Party, right? And I've seen this for decades. For example, DeSantis seems very interesting and so on.
Yeah.
And he's making the right noises. But we've seen these kind of things before. These people make the right noises and they never actually make any difference. So they don't actually change anything. And so that's, I say I'm optimistic, but I come back to this all the time that I'm pessimistic in the short term, in the sense that nobody's coming to save us.
No.
Right? There's no universe through the current system that allows us to regain the position that's necessary. So it's not strictly true to say I'm optimistic in the short term. But at the same time, the impulse is to cheer on DeSantis and to say, stick it to him. And to imagine, and this is actually, to me, it seems a real defect in right-wing thinking, that we say incompatible things, which is, we don't believe this is going to save us, but we act like it's going to save us because they're doing things that are pushing back against our enemies, even though we know those things are in practice ineffective. I don't have a solution for this, though, except for my old one, which is waiting around for the collapse, which so far hasn't happened.
I mean, I basically got that criticism over the Flight 93 election, published September of 2016, in which I said we have to take a risk on Trump. And, lots of people just decided to willfully misunderstand it as saying, Anton's saying Trump will be a savior. I didn't, it's worth a try. It's got to be, first of all, it's got to be better than Hillary, however bad it is. It can't be that bad. And I realize the odds are long, but whatever we can do through this we got to try to do. So I would say the same thing about DeSantis. I agree with you right now. He's the best possibility we have. I don't really trust any of the others. We've already seen several of them capitulate, like Kristi Noem over the trend. That was just disgraceful. Folding up like a tent, and I think kills her chances of being a nominee in 2024. I have very little hope. First of all, I have very little hope that a Republican can win a national election again ever. That's my guesstimate, that they just can't. But flukes happen. I believe 2016 was essentially a fluke, so it could happen. And then I have very little hope that if a Republican could get into office, he can do anything, because the opposition within the federal government itself is alone so overwhelming as to make government via executive power all but impossible for anybody who, it's easy for a Democrat because the bureaucracy does what you want. Yes. You're already aligned. It's not easy for a Republican. And then you have all the other sectors of society that are against it. So nonetheless, if DeSantis is the nominee, I'd be the first, I support him. But yeah, you're right. There is a certain, if somebody wanted to say, well, Anton, you say you support him. Are you telling me I should go vote for him? Yes. Are you saying you expect him to lose? Yes. Are you saying even if he won, he wouldn't be able to do anything? Yes. People are like, well, what the hell are you talking about? I go, I'm just answering all three questions honestly.
Well, I have a fourth question for you. Let's say DeSantis won. Would you accept a position in the administration, right? You're fairly high profile. You have worked in the White House before. You have all sorts of interesting thoughts on all sorts of interesting things, only a few of which have been covered here and only a few of which could be allowed to be covered here. So would you take a job in the administration?
I mean, my gut reaction now is to say no. For a lot of reasons, but then again, you're in the circumstance, it actually happens and you're in the circumstance and the offer is made, I might have a different opinion.
Sure,
I do find those jobs are fun. They're exciting, and who knows, I'll be a lot older then, but
don't be that much older. It's like 3.5 years.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I went into the White House for the first time I was 31. I went into the White House the second time I was 47. So the next time I would be 55.
Well, as my aunt, I agree that 50s, it's all downhill. But as my aunt said when I entered my 40s, pointed out that the Romans said the 40s were the prime of life.
Yeah.
So you're still at least coasting on the fumes of the 40s when you're 55. I mean, so you can still do something. You make it sound like you're going to be dead at 55.
No, but it is kind of a young man's game, a job like that with those hours and that level of intensity.
Yeah, that's true.
And I'm not sure how I'm going to feel about it, especially if I don't really have any great, I did go into the Trump administration not thinking we're going to change everything, but I thought, here's this huge opportunity. I have to be here. I don't know what's going to come of it, but I got to be here and see where it goes. And I saw where it went, and I was like, and I went in thinking the bureaucracy is going to make this really hard on us. And then it was way harder than even I thought. And so my tolerance for that, probably for another try, is going to be even lower. Just like, why?
Jake, I understand that. So
it's like, imagine it like this, okay? There's 2 football conferences and all of the winning teams are in one conferences and we win the loser conference. So we get to go to the big game. I am taking the field in the big game, but I know that the odds arrayed against me are such that I can't win this game. That's what I would feel like going into another, if it was a real nationalist populist administration actually trying to do things that the regime didn't want, it would just be completely Sisyphean and frustrating. And that sounds very defeatist. And maybe the right thing to do, like Jaffa, is to just fight it anyway, because you have a noble duty. And maybe I would do that, but my intellectual reaction would be, oh God, not this again.
Yeah. I mean, not that anyone would ever offer me a job in the administration because my spicy takes are pretty spicy, but you can never tell. I just would never do it. I would never move to DC. I mean, I worked briefly for the Justice Department many years ago, and I worked briefly for the Justice Department many years ago, and DC was just a radically different place then. I understand. I haven't been back there in 20 years, as I touched on the other day, and it's just a hellhole as far as I can tell. I would hate to live there.
It really got physically and quality of life, and I don't live in the district, thank God, but it got substantially, dramatically, abruptly worse in the summer of 2020 and hasn't recovered. The amount of closures and streets just given over to mayhem and boarded up windows and homelessness and street debris and stuff shot up. It kind of became, in a sense, a combination of Times Square 1976 and I don't know what's like a kind of semi-abandoned city like Camden, New Jersey, all at once. Now it's not that bad, I exaggerate, but like it's not the place that it was, where even if you don't share Blue America's political opinions, you enjoyed the restaurants and the street scenes and the monuments and this and that. Like it lost a lot.
Bad.
And I think every city, my sense is that almost every major city in America, not that I've spent a ton of time in them lately, but everybody I talk to who either lives in New York or spends time in New York says it fell off a cliff and has not recovered. And I know San Francisco, where I used to spend a lot of time, is in a similar, just very, very bad state right now. And no, I guess, from a Haywoodian perspective, this is one of the reasons to hope, right? There doesn't seem to be any sense from the Blue America ruling class that we went too far. This is actually a problem. Let's start fixing it. They're just doubling, tripling, and quadrupling down on everything.
None of that.
We need more crime. We need more mayhem. We need more homeless. We have to close more businesses, and just everything has to get worse. And I'm going like, can this just continue forever?
I think there's an important distinction to be made here between the ruling class or a certain crust of Blue America and the rest of Blue America. Because I know from my background, a lot of, for example, big firm lawyers in Chicago.
Yeah.
Many of whom are is somewhere left on the political spectrum, but not all of them, most of them are somewhat blue America. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're politically oriented, but it is truly astounding to me how universally all those people, admittedly, they're my friends. So they're self-selected. They're willing to associate with a guy like me. But they have, to a person, man and woman, gone out and gone through the very lengthy process in Illinois of getting permission to own a firearm, which takes a year, and concealed carry permits. So all these Blue American people who you had suggested to me 5 years ago would be doing anything of the sort, have all gone out and gone through extensive work to get guns. And so I think there's a large amount of people in Blue America, but they all know, they're all partners with these big law firms you've heard of. They all know that if they said any of this, they would be fired instantly, much less anything like negative about any of the various manifestations of blue state America. So it makes me a little bit more hopeful that there's people who are in blue state America and, in a sense, off blue state America, that are aware, just preparing for the collapse of the cities as a result of these policies. So I totally agree that they're continuing to push those same policies at the top.
But by the way, if one of your friends actually found himself in a crime situation on the streets of Chicago and used that weapon, I mean, his life would be over, wouldn't it? They'd go to jail. They'd go to jail. I mean, do they not know that?
They do know that. They're preparing for something different. They're preparing for when the crackle of small arms fire is all over their neighborhood. So when nobody cares anymore, they're preparing for either last ditch, like people are invading their house,
right,
or for something where everything's gone to hell and they need to get out of the city. So, but again, that fits with me. I'm a bone paranoid, right? This is not news, but it's weird for all these people that I know to take this attitude, and because it's such a radical change for them. I think that's lost in kind of news reports about a lot of blue America.
Okay.
So there's my optimism for the day. There you go. So I don't use pill analogies, but I think they're overdone. So we'll just say optimism.
All right. Well, first, I want to thank Charles for doing this. It was, as I said, the whole point of this was self-indulgence for the two of us. And I think we indulged ourselves. I had a great time. I hope he had a great time. I'm not indifferent to the question of whether the listeners had a great time, but your enjoyment of this is definitely secondary to ours. And so mission accomplished from our perspective. And read The Worthy House. Go check it out. It's the best book review going out there. And of course, I don't need to tell you to read the Claremont Review of Books or the American Mind, because if you're listening to this, you already do. But if there are any of you who found this without having previously found those, well, then go check them out too. And now I'll hand it back to Ryan Williams.
Well, thank you everyone for listening to this special edition of the American Mind podcast. Thank you to Charles and Mike for that engrossing and penetrating conversation. As Mike said, you should go visit theworthyhouse.com. And if you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all of our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and our new Washington Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks to the production and engineering crew, as always, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. Thanks, everybody.